wounded and abandoned, until one human changed everything. The first thing Rail did when he saw the alien was check if it was dead. It was not dead, that was the problem. Rail had been fixing the water recycler behind the outer maintenance shed when he found it. He had crawled under the pipe housing with a wrench and a light and come out the other side into a narrow gap between the shed wall and the outpost's perimeter barrier, a gap nobody used because it was barely wide enough to stand in, and there it was, curled against the barrier wall, breathing in shallow, uneven pulls, taking up almost the entire space. It was a vreth. That was the species name, vreth. He had seen the classification in a border briefing 2 weeks ago. Quadrupedal at full size, but this one was folded into itself, knees drawn up, one arm wrapped around its own midsection. Its hide was a deep blue-black, not scales exactly, more like layered plates, each one thin as a fingernail and overlapping the next. 2 of them on its side were cracked. Dark fluid had dried around the cracks in a shape that told Rail the injury was not new. He stood very still. The vreth's eyes were closed. Its breathing was the only sound in the gap. Somewhere above them the outpost hummed and clanked the way outposts do, machinery running, people moving, the ordinary noise of a place that did not know something was dying behind its maintenance shed. Rail crouched down. He was 26 years old and had been a maintenance technician for the Human Forward Unit on Gata Station for 4 months. He was not a medic. He was not a soldier. He fixed pipes and power couplings and atmospheric filters, and he was good at it, and up until this moment that had been entirely sufficient. He put his hand near the vreth's face, not touching, just close enough to feel breath. The breath came, warm and faint. He said quietly, to no one in particular, "Okay." He went inside. He came back 7 minutes later with a medic kit, 2 thermal sheets, a water canteen, and a protein block, which he was aware was probably the wrong food, but was the only food he had on him. He squeezed back into the gap and set everything down and opened the medic kit on the ground. The vreth's eyes opened when he clicked the kit latch. They were green. Not one shade of green, several, like something had dropped different pigments into water and let them spread. They fixed on Rail with the sharp focus of something that was in pain, but was not going to let pain slow its threat assessment. Rail held up both hands. "Empty." He said, "Not going to hurt you." He said it in standard and then in the 2 alien languages he knew well enough to approximate, neither of which was vreth language, but tone travels even when words do not. The vreth did not move. Its eyes stayed on him. He lowered his hand slowly and picked up the scanner from the kit. He held it up and turned it so the vreth could see it from all sides. Not a weapon. He ran it over his own arm first, demonstrating. The scanner beeped softly. He showed the vreth the readout screen. Then he pointed at the cracked plates on the vreth's side. The vreth's eyes moved from Rail's face to the scanner and back. It did not move away. Rail leaned in and ran the scanner slowly along the injured side. The readout populated. He was not trained to read medical scans in full, but he could read enough. The cracked plates were the surface problem. Underneath them, something had compressed badly, and there was fluid where fluid was not supposed to be. He sat back on his heels and thought. He thought about going to get Sira, who was the unit's actual medic. He thought about how to explain what was in the gap behind the maintenance shed without starting a chain of reporting that ended with someone deciding the vreth was a threat. He thought about the border briefing and what it had said about vreth biology. He thought about the fluid on the readout. He thought about all of this for about 90 seconds, which was fast for someone making a decision that would define the next 2 months of his life. Then he pulled out his comm, typed a single message to Sira that said medical question, no emergency. Can you come to maintenance shed alone, and put the comm back in his pocket. He looked at the vreth. He said, someone is coming who knows more than I do. She is good. I will stay here until she gets here. The vreth made a sound, low, clicking at the back like a stone rolling over other stones. Rail did not know what it meant. He nodded anyway because it seemed like the thing to do. He sat down against the pipe housing with his back to the wall, close enough that the Vreth could see him clearly but with enough space that nothing felt crowded. He put the water canteen on the ground between them. After a moment the Vreth's eyes, which had stayed open and watchful, moved to the canteen. Rael pushed it a few centimeters closer. The Vreth looked at it for a long time. Then it moved one hand, very slowly, and touched the canteen with the tip of one finger. Rael said, "Yeah, it is water. It is yours." The Vreth did not drink yet, but its breathing changed just slightly. Less shallow, like something had downgraded its assessment from immediate danger to wait and see. Rael had fixed hundreds of broken things in 4 months on Gata Station. Pipes, couplings, filters, machines that stopped working and needed someone patient enough to figure out why. He was patient. That had always been his best quality. He waited. Behind the maintenance shed, in a gap that nobody used, 2 very different kinds of living things sat in the noise of the outpost and did not frighten each other. And that was, for the moment, enough. Sierra Mack had been a medic for 9 years, and she had treated things in that time that most people would not believe if she described them at a dinner table. She had worked a crash site on a methane moon. She had treated a species that communicated entirely through color shifts and had to diagnose it by guessing which colors meant pain. She had once kept a 7-limbed cargo loader alive for 6 hours with nothing but field tape and a prayer. She was not easily surprised. She was surprised by the gap behind the maintenance shed. Not by the Vreth exactly. By Rael, sitting cross-legged on the ground next to it, the medic kit open around him like he had been there long enough to get comfortable, talking quietly about something she could not hear through the wall. She squeezed into the gap. The Vreth's eyes came to her immediately, sharp and measuring. She crouched down and looked at the scanner readout on the kit screen. She looked at the cracked plates. She looked at the dried fluid. She said under her breath, "How long has it been here?" Rael said he did not know. At least a day by the look of the dried fluid, maybe longer. Sierra said it needed more than a field kit. Rael said he knew. He said he needed her to tell him how much more and whether it could wait a few hours. She looked at him. She said, "Wait for what?" He said, "For me to figure out how to bring it inside without it becoming a report that ends badly." Sierra sat back on her heels. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the Vreth. The Vreth looked at her with those layered green eyes, still doing the threat assessment, still deciding. She reached into the kit and took out the tissue sealant. She held it up. She showed it to the Vreth the same way Rael had shown the scanner, turning it slowly. Then she pointed at the cracked plates. The Vreth watched her. It did not move away. She worked. It took about 30 minutes to seal the surface damage well enough that the immediate fluid loss stopped. The deeper problem was still there, and she could not address it with what she had in the gap, but stopping the surface bleed bought time. When she finished, she sat back and looked at Rael and said, 2 days. After 2 days, the fluid buildup will be a serious problem. Rael nodded. He said 2 days is enough. She said, enough for what exactly? He said he had been thinking about the empty calibration room on sublevel 2. It was not used for anything. It had its own ventilation and its own power line, and the door had a manual lock that only registered on the maintenance system, not the security log. He said he had access to that lock because 3 weeks ago the atmospheric sensor in there had been glitching, and he had been assigned to fix it. Sierra stared at him. She said, "You want to hide a critically injured alien in a sublevel calibration room." He said, "Just until it is stable enough to have the conversation about what happens next with someone senior who will actually think about it rather than just file a containment order." She said, "This could end your posting." He said, "Yes." She said, "It could end mine too if I treat it without logging it." He said, "Yes." He said he was sorry for that. He said she could say no, and he would understand. She looked at the Vreth again. It had been watching the two of them with a stillness that reminded her of something, and after a moment she placed it. It reminded her of patients who had been waiting a long time to find out if help was coming or not, the specific stillness of someone holding their breath. She said, "Fine. Tonight, after the shift rotation at 2200 when the sublevel corridor is empty." Rael said, "Thank you." She said, "Do not thank me yet." She said also, "You are carrying it. I have a bad knee." Moving the Vreth took an hour and left both of them sore and sweating. It was not large by Vreth standards. She had gathered that from the briefing, but it was still heavier than anything she had moved without equipment assistance. It could walk slowly with support, which helped. They went through the maintenance sub-corridor, the one that ran under the east wing, and came up through the sublevel service hatch. The calibration room was small and cold, and smelled like ozone from the old sensor equipment. Rael had brought a thermal mat and laid it out in the corner. He had brought water and the protein block he had offered earlier and two more that he had gathered without being specific about what they were for when someone asked. The Vreth settled onto the mat. Its breathing was better than it had been in the gap, slightly fuller. Either the sealant was helping or being horizontal was. Rael sat on the floor nearby. He had brought his tool bag because sitting in a room for no reason looked suspicious if someone came in, but a technician doing documentation after a maintenance call did not. Sira set up a basic monitor and showed him what numbers to watch. Before she left, she looked at the Vreth one more time. She said, "In standard, we are not going to let anything happen to you." She did not know if it understood. It watched her with those green layered eyes. She went back to her bunk and lay on her back staring at the ceiling and thought about what she had just done. After a while she stopped thinking about it, because it was already done and she found she did not regret it, and that told her something about herself that she filed away for later. Rael stayed until the Vreth fell asleep. He worked on his documentation quietly. The room hummed. The station ran its ordinary nighttime operations above them. Nobody came. On the third day, the Vreth fixed something. Rael had not asked it to. He had not even been paying attention when it happened. He had brought his work into the calibration room again, a diagnostic tablet and a relay coupling that had been giving him problems for a week, and he had been sitting on the floor trying to isolate the fault while Sira changed the dressings on the cracked plates. The coupling had 3 internal contacts that were supposed to align when the housing was closed. They kept slipping. He had been closing and opening the housing for 20 minutes, adjusting and readjusting, making a small, frustrated sound each time. He put it down for a moment to hand Sira a different grade of sealant. When he picked the coupling back up, one of the contacts had been bent very slightly, a correction so small he could not see it with his eyes, but when he closed the housing the contacts aligned and stayed. He ran the diagnostic. Green. He turned around. The Vreth was watching him from the mat, not lying down anymore, sitting up on its forelimbs, those green eyes calm. One of its hands was resting in a position that matched the position his hand had been in when he was working on the coupling. It had watched him long enough to understand what he was doing and had reached over while he was not looking and made the adjustment with one of its thin, precise claws. Rael held the working coupling up. The Vreth made a sound, short, 2-part soft. Rael said, "You fixed it." The Vreth looked at the coupling. It made the sound again. Sira said, "I think that means yes." Rael said he did not know the Vreth language at all, not even basics. He said the border briefing had mentioned that Vreth communication was partly sonic and partly a system of small, precise movements. He said he did not have a translation module. Sira said she could requisition one from the comms locker. She said she could log it as a diagnostic tool for atmospheric sensors, which was technically one of its secondary functions. Rael said, "You are getting better at this." She said, "I am getting better at something." She was not certain it was a quality she wanted to develop. The module arrived the following morning. It was a slim unit, older model, with a Vreth language file that dated from a survey mission 8 years prior. Rail turned it on and held it up and said, "Can you hear this?" The Vreth looked at the module. It made a sound. The module processed for 4 seconds and then said, in flat, even tones, "Hear yes." Rail said, "Good." He said, "My name is Rail." The module processed. The Vreth was still. Then it made a sound and the module said, "Name question." Rail said, "Yes, what is your name?" A long pause. The Vreth made a sound that was longer and more complex than anything it had made before. The module processed for nearly 10 seconds. Then it said, "No name. Number only." Rail sat with that for a moment. He said, "Then I will call you something, if that is all right." The module processed. The Vreth made a short sound. The module said, "Call what?" Rail thought. He looked at the Vreth's hide, the deep blue-black plates with the faint, iridescent quality when the room light moved across them. He said, "Ink, because of the color." The module processed. The Vreth looked at its own forearm, made a sound. Module said, "Color yes." Rail said, "Is that acceptable?" Long pause. Then a sound the module translated as acceptable yes. Sierra said quietly that this was the most communication she had witnessed between a human and a Vreth in 9 years of border postings. Rail said, "Most people probably do not sit on the floor with them for 3 days." She said, "Fair point." Over the following days, something shifted in the calibration room. It happened slowly and without announcement. Ink began to sit up for longer periods. He started watching Rail work with the focused attention that Rail was beginning to recognize as interest rather than threat assessment. He began to use the module more, initiating exchanges rather than just responding. Short ones. Questions about what Rail was doing, what a specific tool was called, why a certain repair required a certain sequence. Rail answered everything. He never simplified more than he had to. He had noticed early that Ink understood concepts faster than the module could translate them, which meant the intelligence was there and had always been there, and what had been missing was just language. On the 6th day, Ink asked, through the module, what happened to the other ones. Rail asked which other ones. Ink said the ones that were here before. He made a sound the module translated as, "This station, other living things before you." Rail said the station had been a joint observation post. He said both alien factions had used it for different purposes at different times. He said some of those purposes had not been good ones. Ink was quiet. Then he asked through the module what happened to the ones they kept here. Rail said honestly he did not know specifically. He said he was sorry. Ink made a sound the module flagged as untranslatable and looked at the wall for a while. Rail did not fill that silence. He had learned early that Ink did not want it filled, that he processed things in quiet, and that talking over the quiet was a kind of interruption. He sat and worked on his tablet and let the room be still. After a long time, Ink said, through the module, "You are different from the ones before." Rail said, "How do you mean?" Ink said, "The ones before did not sit on the floor." Rail looked up. Ink was looking at him with those layered green eyes, and in them was something that was not quite humor and was not quite grief, but was somewhere between the two. The expression of something that had survived long enough to find the distance between hard things and funny things to be shorter than it used to be. Rail said, "I like the floor. Good angle on the work." The module processed this. Ink made a sound. The module said, "Good angle, yes." It was the first time, in 6 days, that anything in the calibration room had felt light. Commander Yale found out on the 9th day, not because Rail told her but because she had been doing a station audit and found a thermal anomaly on sublevel 2 that did not match any registered equipment. She came down alone. That told Rail something about her later when he had time to think about it. A commander who finds an unexplained thermal signature in a sublevel room and comes to look at it alone is either very confident or very curious, and Yale was both. She opened the door and stood in the frame. Ink was sitting up on the mat. Rael was on the floor 2 meters away with his tool bag. Sierra was updating her treatment log on a tablet. The module was on the ground between Rael and Ink. Everyone in the room went still. Yale looked at Ink for a long moment. She looked at Rael. She looked at Sierra. She looked at the module. She looked at the treatment supplies arranged neatly along the wall. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She said, "How long?" Rael said, 9 days. She said, "The injury?" Sierra said, "Stable now. Was not when he found it." Yale said, "He." Rael said, "His name is Ink." Yale looked at Ink again. Ink looked back at her with the careful, measuring attention he gave everything new. His hands were still. His plates had settled into a flat position that Rael had come to understand meant not aggressive, just watching. Yale crouched down slowly and looked at the healed surface damage on Ink's side. She did not touch. She just looked, with the analytical focus of someone reading a situation in detail. She said, "How did he get here?" Rael said he did not know. He said Ink did not talk about it directly. He said what he did know was that the cracked plates and internal compression were consistent with a fall from a significant height, and that someone had removed Ink's identification tags before abandoning him, which meant whoever had done this had wanted it to be difficult to trace. Yale was quiet. Then she said to the module, "What happened to you?" The module processed. Ink looked at Yale. He made a sound. Module said, "Fell," then was pushed. Yale said, "Who pushed you?" Ink made a sound. Module said, "Does not matter now." Yale said, "It matters to me." Ink looked at her. Long pause. Then he made a sound that the module took time with. When it finished it said, "The ones who used us for the high work, the exterior repair teams. We did the work no one else could do because we could grip the station hull with our hands. When the contract ended, they did not want to pay transport cost for a unit. Easier to remove the tags. Easier to let the fall happen." Yale did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Used us, plural." Ink said nothing. Yale said, "There were others." Module said, "Were yes." The room was very quiet. Rael had known pieces of this. He had guessed at others, but hearing it through the module, flat and even, was different from guessing. He looked at his hands. He thought about the station hull and the gripping and the high exterior work and the contract ending and the math that someone had done about transport costs. Yale stood up. She said to Rael and Sierra, "I need to think about this." She said, "Nothing changes today." She said, "Nobody talks to anyone about this room until I come back." Rael said, "Yes." She looked at Ink one more time. She said directly to him, "I am going to look into this. I want you to know that." Module processed. Ink made a sound. Module said, "Why?" Yale said, "Because what was done to you was wrong, and I do not walk past wrong things." Ink was very still. He looked at Yale. He looked at Rael. He made a sound the module processed for a long time. Module said, "You are all like this." Yale said, "Like what?" Module said, "The word Ink used was not in the translation file." The module offered the closest match. It said, "Facing toward." Yale said she did not understand. Rael said quietly, "I think I do." He said, "Ink is that a Vreth word?" Ink made a sound. Module said, "Old word, yes." Rael said, "It means the ones who face toward the problem instead of away from it." Ink looked at him, made a short sound. Module said, "Yes, correct." Yale said, "That is what it looks like from outside." Rael said he supposed it was. She said, "We should look like that more often then." She said she would be back in the morning and she would have a plan, and she needed both of them sharp and ready to have an uncomfortable conversation with her. She left. Rael sat back down on the floor. He picked up his tool bag. He found a coupling he had been meaning to look at for 3 days. Ink watched him for a moment, then he made a sound. Module said, "She will help." Rael said, "Yes, I think she will." Ink said through the module, You were sure before she came. Rail said not sure. He said hopeful. He said there is a difference, but sometimes it does not feel like one. Ink looked at the coupling in Rail's hands. He reached over, precise as always, and with one claw adjusted something small. Rail ran the diagnostic. Green. He said thank you. Ink said through the module good angle. Rail smiled. He said yes, good angle. Yale came back in the morning with 3 things: a personnel file, a legal contact, and a look on her face that meant she had not slept and had found something that made the sleeplessness worthwhile. She sat down on the floor. Rail noticed this and did not comment. Sierra was already there. Ink was awake and sitting up, watching the door as he always did when it opened. Yale put the personnel file on the ground. She said, the exterior repair contract for this station was held by a company called Drev Consolidated. They operated for 11 months and pulled out when the observation post changed status after the ceasefire. She said Drev Consolidated had brought in 12 Vreth units for the whole work. She said the departure manifest logged 8. Sierra said 4 missing. Yale said 4 unaccounted. She said the manifest listed them as released on site, which was a category she had never seen before in a departure record, and which appeared to have been invented for this specific filing. Rail said released on site. What does that mean? Yale said it means nothing. She said it was language designed to fill a box without meaning anything that could be held against anyone. She said someone had signed off on it, and she now knew who, and she was going to have a long communication with the Contract Oversight Office before the end of the day. She turned to Ink. She said through the module, I need to ask you something. She said the others, do you know where they went? Ink was still for a long time. Then he made a series of sounds, longer than usual, and the module worked through them slowly. Module said 2 went over the north side. Long fall. He said they were not moving when he last saw them. He said 1 went south but was injured before that and he did not know. He said he was the last to go and he went over the east side and the thing he landed on slowed him enough. The thing he landed on was the maintenance pipe housing behind the shed. Rail had wondered what had bent those pipes. Yale said, I am going to send a search unit to the north and south perimeters. She said she was logging it as a routine debris check, so it did not flag anything before she was ready. She said she did not know what they would find. She said she was sorry. Ink made a sound. Module said you did not do it. Yale said no. But I am the commander of this station and it happened at this station, and that means I carry part of it. Ink looked at her for a long moment. He made a sound. Module said carrying, not the same as causing. Yale said no, not the same, but still real. The legal contact was a specialist in non-citizen labor claims, based at the Galactic Council's regional office. Yale had reached her at first light, and had described the situation in careful terms. The specialist had said that what Yale was describing, if documented, constituted illegal abandonment of contracted labor under 3 separate council statutes. She said the removal of identification tags alone was grounds for a full investigation. She said if Yale had a living witness, she needed to secure that witness's formal statement immediately. Ink gave the statement that afternoon. It took 2 hours. The module struggled with some of the legal phrasing and Rail acted as an informal interpreter, not of language but of concept, finding the plain version of each question so Ink could understand what was being asked and give an accurate answer. Sierra documented the physical evidence. She had kept records of every treatment since the gap behind the shed, photographs, scanned data, the specific pattern of the injuries and what they indicated about the height and angle of the fall, everything filed, dated, and signed. When it was done, Ink sat quietly for a while. Rail said, "Are you all right?" Ink made a sound. Module said, "Tired," then "Good tired, different kind." Rail said, "The kind after you do something that needed doing." Ink said through the module, "Yes." Rail said, "I know that kind." Ink looked at him. He made a sound the module translated as, "You were a maintenance person." He said, "You fix things. Why did you come into the gap? A maintenance person could have walked past." Rail thought about how to answer this. He said he had heard something. He said it sounded like something that was trying very hard not to make a sound and failing, and he had heard that kind of sound before from machines that were close to failing, and he had never once been able to hear it and walk away. He said, "I fix things." He said, "That is the whole answer." Ink was quiet. Then he said something long and complex that the module processed for a long time. Module said, "On my world before, we had a tradition. When someone fixed a thing that was considered unfixable, a broken water system, a collapsed structure, something everyone else had given up on, the one who fixed it was given a name gift, a second name, not a replacement, an addition, a name that said this is someone who does not stop." Rail said, "I did not fix anything that impressive." Ink said through the module, "You fixed the thing that needed fixing. The size is not the point." Rail was quiet. Ink made a sound. The module said, "I would like to give you the name gift, if you allow it." Rail said, "I allow it." Ink said a sound, short and clean and specific. The module could not translate it. Rail asked him to say it again. Ink did. Rail asked what it meant. Module said, "Closest translation, the one who stays." Rail sat with that. He said, "I like it." Ink said through the module, "Good. Now you have it. It cannot be taken back." Outside the sublevel room, the station ran its operations, and the search teams went out to the north and south perimeters, and the specialist at the council office began filing the first documents in what would become a 14-month investigation into Drev Consolidated. None of that happened fast. Important things rarely did. But it had started, and starting was the part that required someone. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected, because Yale was the kind of person who followed up every 3 days and never let a communication go unanswered for more than an hour. Drev Consolidated's contract licenses were suspended inside 6 weeks. The individual who had signed the departure manifest was identified. The Galactic Council's Labor Division opened a full inquiry. It would take time. These things always took time. But the mechanism was moving, and mechanisms in motion are harder to stop than mechanisms at rest. Of the 4 Vreth, one had survived in the south. She was found by the search team on the 2nd day, sheltering in a drainage channel under the outer wall, injured but alive. Sira treated her. She was younger than Ink and quieter, and it took longer for her to trust anything, which was entirely reasonable. The 2 on the north side were not found alive. Yale wrote a formal record for each of them, names unknown, and filed it with the council. She said to Rail and Sira that someone should know they existed. That someone had written their names into the record even if the record only said unknown. She said that mattered. Rail thought it did too. Ink's physical recovery was complete by the 4th week. Sira had cleared him with the kind of thorough satisfaction she brought to all successful treatments, running the final scan 3 times because she wanted to be certain. When she showed him the readout, all green, he looked at it for a long time and then made a sound the module said was something close to, "Weight gone." She said, "Does it feel different?" He said through the module, "Yes." Said, "I had forgotten what it felt like without the weight." She said, "That is a thing people say after recovering." She said, "The body forgets its baseline when the pain goes on long enough." She said, "Give it time and you will stop being surprised by it." He said, "You know this from others." She said, "From many others." He said, "You have done this a long time." She said, 9 years. He made a sound. Module said, "Good work." She said, "I think so too." She said it without false modesty, which Rail appreciated, and he thought Ink did too. A Vreth community representative arrived on the 41st day. Her name was Addis, and she had come from the free settlement 3 relay jumps away, which was a significant distance, and indicated how seriously the community had taken the council's notification. She was formal and efficient and spent 2 hours in documented session with Ink before she came to find Rail. She found him in the maintenance corridor replacing an atmospheric filter. He was on a step platform with his tool bag open below him. She stood at the bottom of the platform and said, "You are the one who found him." He said yes. She said, "And the other one?" He said that was the search team. He said, "Commander Yale ordered the search." Addis was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "In the Vreth community there is a custom. When someone outside the community performs an act that brings one of us home, the community holds a naming for them." She said this was a formal thing, not ceremonial in an empty way but recorded in the community history. She said that Ink had already requested this for Rail and for Yale and for Sira. Rail came down from the platform. He said, "I do not know what to say to that." She said, "You do not have to say anything." She said, "It is already done." She said, "We do not ask permission for gratitude." He stood there for a moment and then said, "Is Ink leaving with you?" She said, "That is his choice." She said the settlement was there if he wanted it. She said the other survivor, the young one, had already agreed to come and Ink could make his own decision. Ink came to find Rail late that evening. He came to the calibration room which they still used, out of habit now rather than necessity. The mat was still in the corner. The module was on the floor. The tool bag was open. Ink sat down. Rail sat down across from him. Ink said through the module, "I am going." Rail said, "I know." Ink said the young one needs someone familiar. She is still afraid of most things. He said, "I know what that is. I can help with that." Rail said, "That sounds right." Ink looked around the small room. He said, 41 days in this room." Rail said, 42, counting the gap behind the shed. Ink made the sound. Module said, "Good angle." Rail said, "Yes." They sat for a while without using the module. There were things that did not need it by now. The module was for new information and formal things. What sat in the room that evening was neither of those. After a while, Ink reached into the space beside the mat and picked up a small piece of hull plating, thin, iridescent blue-black, one of his own plates that had shed during the healing. He placed it on the ground in front of Rail. Rail picked it up. It was lighter than it looked. The color shifted when he turned it. Ink said through the module, "We do not have the carrying thing. The thing you described, where you give something heavy to someone else to hold." Rail said, "Yes." Ink said, "But we have this." He said, "When something important happens, when a place or a time matters, we leave a piece. So the place remembers we were there, so the time does not just pass." Rail held the plate. He said, "I will keep this." Ink said, "I know." In the morning, Addis's transport lifted off from the eastern pad with Ink and the young one on board. Rail stood outside the maintenance shed and watched it go. Sira stood next to him. Yale stood on his other side, which he had not expected but which felt correct. The transport got small very fast against the pale station sky. Sira said, "I think that went well." Yale said, "I think so too." Rail said nothing. He turned the small piece of hull plating in his hand. The color shifted. Blue, black, something between the two that did not have a name. He put it in his pocket. He picked up his tool bag. There was always something on the station that needed fixing. There always would be. He was good at it and patient, and he did not walk past things that were making sounds they should not be making. He went to work.